We often get asked here, how many tanks do we actually own here in the Armourgeddon collection? Well, today we're going to go through every single one just to show you guys how many we have. But before we do so, what is the definition of a tank? Well, according to the Oxford Dictionary, a military tank is a heavily armed fighting vehicle equipped with guns and moving on a continuous, articulated metal tracks. So with that knowledge, let's get on with the list. Starting off our list is probably one of the weirdest looking vehicles in our collection and probably of the whole Second World War. This is what we call the M3a1. Now, it gets quite confused with the Grant, which is a very similar vehicle. The turret's a little bit different, but this one we know is an M3a1 because we do have the original purchase order from it from World War II. So this one is a Lee. Now, one of the weirdest parts of this vehicle is this 76mm gun, which has pretty much just been bolted into the front right-hand side of the vehicle. On top, they have got the 37mm on top, but the reason they did this is mainly because at the beginning of the war, the technology for the turrets hadn't really evolved enough. You couldn't really shove one of these on top and have a fully working vehicle. So instead, like I say, they'd keep the 37mm on top. In total, you'd have 7 people in here, which is absolutely insane. Especially because 7 people in here, you compare it to the Sherman, which had 5, and then modern tanks that have 4, sometimes even 3 people. It's just an insane amount of people in one vehicle, especially if it was to be hit. Surprisingly, the Lee did see quite a long service history. Originally, it was 1941, and I think it got used well until about 1955 or so. Now, this one exactly, this Lee, firstly, we believe it was used in Burma. After Burma, it got sent over to Malaysia, where there was a big uprising happening in the 1950s, and after that, it got sent over to Australia. Moving on to tank number 2, this is the Charioteer. Now, this is the most current active restoration that we're doing here at Armourgeddon. As you can see, Nitro's just there grinding stuff away at the moment. Now, with this one, Charioteer, not the most well-known tank in the world, but the tank that it was originally based off is a Cromwell from 1944, as you can sort of see by the running gear, a lot more famous tank. The Charioteer, they were all converted in 1952, and there were about 450 of them converted, I believe. Now, it was used by the British Army, but this one originally got sent over to Finland. Now, last year, we went over to the cameraman Dave, who's currently filming, went over to Finland for a military auction and ended up buying it for us on our behalf. It then came over to the UK in, I believe, February and sat idle for a few months, and finally, though, we're getting on and restoring it, and they are making some very fast progress. So fingers crossed, hopefully by Christmas, it should be up and running. We'll see. It weighs 28.5 tons. Surprisingly, it only actually had a 3-man crew. Sometimes it would have a 4th, but that was more of an observation role on the outside, and the gun is actually a 20-pounder. So let's move on to the next tank. And now the third one on our list, our newest tank, just here, is the Churchill Mark 7. Now, we only got this about a month and a half ago, and ever since then, it has pretty much stayed sat out here. It is going to be one of our vehicles that we do restore, but that's not going to be until probably late 2027. Now, a little bit of history about this old girl. Originally, she was made in 1944, and after the war, she ended up getting sent over to Australia, and it actually got used for logging, which we'll throw a picture up just now to sort of see what she was like. After that, she got brought back to the UK, sent over to America, and then finally brought over to here. And hopefully, this is going to be her final resting place. Hopefully, she now will stay in the UK forever, especially once we've got her restored. Now, we're projecting the restoration isn't actually going to take a crazy amount of time. When we get onto it, we reckon it's probably only going to take a few months, mainly because there's a lot of stuff on here, and I'll show you inside in just a second. There's most of the parts are on here, so we're not going to really have to be fabricating or finding a crazy amount of parts. She doesn't run yet, but the engine, I'd say, is about 95% of the way there. Now, if you want to go into a deep dive on this vehicle, we have just released another video, so by all means, go check that one out. But let's hop inside. And here we are, sat inside of the Churchill. Now, as I said, it is going to be a restoration, but what a lovely restoration it is. A lot of the bits that we need are already in here, or they've already been freed up, just making our job a hell of a lot easier. Silly little things like, for example, the steering. Now, we're not sure if the steering actually works, because obviously it's not running, so we can't test it, but little things like this. it's all freedom, it moves. It's just going to make the restoration a lot easier. Now, I'm not going to go into crazy detail because, like I say, we've got a whole nother video on it if you do want to see it. But inside the turret, for example, we are missing a few bits. For example, the turret basket is wrong. And obviously, there's just a huge amount of other bits that need to go inside. But overall, it's pretty good condition. So let's move on to the next tank. Moving on to tank number 4 is this beast behind me. It is the Sherman 105mm. Now, Shermans, everyone knows them, everybody loves them. Ours is ever so slightly different. Now, usually you would have a 75mm or a 76mm gun on top, but with this one, it's got the 105. Now, this one was quite commonly used for what they'd call bunker busting. Absolute beast of a vehicle. In total, they made about 50,000 of these, and they started production in 1940 and onwards throughout the war. It is probably one of the most common vehicles of the war, and whenever you think of World War II, especially Allied vehicles, this is going to be one of them. Now, the Armourgeddon Sherman, we ended up getting this, I believe, back in 2010. Now, it was a complete burnt out hull. It had actually been used in Belgium as a Molotov cocktail, well, on a Molotov cocktail range. So you can imagine the amount of damage inside, outside, the whole vehicle needed complete restoration. So it was one of the first restorations that we did here, and it's still here to this day. Absolutely beautiful vehicle, and it even was filmed in the film Fury, if you've ever seen that, which I'm sure you have. It wasn't the main one. We always get asked that quite often. It wasn't the main Fury tank with Brad Pitt and all that. That's one down in Bovington, but this one was one of the ones in the background, so a little bit of a claim to fame for it. Weighing just over 30 tons, she needed a big engine to make sure she could get over all that rough terrain. And that's where the C1 Continental radial engine came into play. Very similar to a lot of other vehicles. For example, the Lee also had one in it as well. But it was just the engine they used quite often at the time, especially on American vehicles. Inside, you'd have 5 crew members. You'd have the driver, the commander, the co-driver, you'd have the gunner, and also the loader. So inside, quite crowded. But let's move on to the next one. Moving on to number 5, this is the Chieftain. This is the main British tank from 1960s up until the 90s. Now, this one behind me is looking a little bit worse for wear. Don't get me wrong. She's actually one of our newest vehicles to our collection. We only got her a few months ago. In that time, we have done a little bit of work on her. Nothing cosmetic, as you can see, but mainly on the engine. 2 of our mechanics, Richie and Matt, have been working tirelessly on her, and they have finally got her moving, which you may have seen in one of our other videos. Absolute beast of a vehicle. Now, I believe it weighs about 55 tons. The gun on top, or the gun over there, not over there, over there, is 120mm as well. Now, the Chieftain tank, it was pretty much the British solution to the Russian problem. You had the Russians with the T-55 and later the T-72. This is pretty much what we made to combat it. In total, I believe we had about 2,500 of these, half of which the British Army used, and the other half we exported around the world. Now, the engine that our mechanics have been working on is what we call a Leyland L60, and that beast of an engine managed to give this a top speed of about 25 miles per hour. Now, one of the quite interesting things on this is its armour. Now, the armour is very similar to a lot of other tanks. However, when you get up to the turret, at its thickest bit is 350mm, which is absolutely insanely thick armour. The crew inside this would be 4, and although the British Army doesn't use this vehicle anymore, it does get used by a couple countries like Iran and Oman, which surprisingly still use the Chieftain tank to this day. But anyway, let's move on to the next one. And here we are, comrades, tank number 6, the world famous T-55. This tank ended up being was the most produced tank in human history so far. This was the main tank of the Soviet forces after World War II and pretty much got used all over the world wherever Soviet forces or Soviet Allied forces would have been. Now, in total, they're not 100% sure, but they estimate close to 100,000 of these and different variants were made. Obviously, it wasn't just the Russians who were making them. All part of the Soviet alliance was. So you had other Eastern European countries like Czechoslovakia, they were making all these sort of vehicles. Now, the T-55 is quite a fast tank, with a top speed of up to 32 miles per hour. The vehicle itself weighs about 36 tonne, and inside you'd have a crew of up to 4 people. Now, compare it to World War II tanks. World War II tanks, it wasn't uncommon to have a co-driver. By now, they'd pretty much completely got rid of it. Remember, these were in service from 1948 onwards. In the driver's area, you'd obviously just have the one driver. In the turret, however, you would still have 3 people. So in the turret, you'd have your loader and the gunner and commander. And now you'll see the footage relayed over the top of this. The commander and the gunner, it was tight. To give you an idea, I got in there with one of the other guys, and you pretty much have to have your legs over the shoulders of the loader. It's fair to say comfort wasn't a key thing when the Soviets were designing this tank. Now this one is number 7. Now you've probably seen this one already. Earlier on this year we brought 8 of these M60 tanks into the UK from Greece. We own 2 of them, the other 6 were bought by a few friends of ours and we've spread them around, some going abroad, others staying here in the UK. But this is the M60. Now there is only one currently here with us at the minute. The other one we sent over to our friend Mr. Hughes, which you've probably heard of already, and he's currently working on it, trying to get it all restored. Now, there is a big glaring hole in this tank, which you can probably see. Now, with these, the American military demanded that once they were out of service, they had to be all cut up. So you'll see up on the turret, they've had some nice big crosses cut out of them, but the main bit is this area here in the driver's area. They have completely cut through everything that was here and made an absolute mess in doing so. It is what it is. It's going to be a vehicle that we're going to hopefully be restoring very soon. But yeah, it's going to take a lot of welding, let's just put it like that. Now, when this is fully restored, it's going to be powered by Continental twin-turbo diesel. And using it, it gets the top speed of about 30 miles per hour. Now, the vehicle itself weighs a little over 50 tons, and this vehicle was actually created in 1957 as a kind of development on from the M3a1 pattern. Now, the Americans made quite a few of these. In total, they made 15,000 of them. Now, the gun on top, originally when it came, it had actually been cut off completely. And as you can see, we have welded it back on. And now that, I believe, is 105mm on top. So again, quite a big gun for it. Now, move on to the next vehicle. If you were to ask a kid to draw a tank, they would, without a doubt, draw something that looks very similar to our tank number 8, the Centurion Mark 13. Now this tank ended up being the main British tank after the war. It very nearly made it into the Second World War, but unfortunately missed out on it in just a few months. But it ended up being used by the British Army well into the late 20th century, only then being replaced by the Chieftain tank later on. The Centurion, unlike other tanks, wasn't mass-produced. In total, they only made about 4,500 of these. It was powered by a Meteor engine, and which gave it a top speed of about 21.5 miles per hour, which isn't crazy fast when you compare it to other vehicles like the Soviet T-55, for example. The gun on top is a 105mm L7, I believe, rifled cannon, and the armour is absolutely insane. In some areas, it reaches up to 150mm thick. All of this adds on to its weight, making the vehicle sit in at about 50 tons. Number 9, the M3a1 Stuart. Now, this one, again, is one of the vehicles that we restored here at Armourgeddon. I believe it was a few years ago, I think 2023. Now, a little bit of history about this old girl. One of the earlier tanks got used a lot in North Africa. With the gun up here, it only had a 37mm, so not very big, especially when you're coming up against the German tanks, especially later on in the war. So because of that, although it was used throughout the war, it was started producing in 1941. It really, once the North African campaign finished, they used it a bit in Italy, and afterwards onwards, they kind of pushed it over to the Pacific so it could fight against lighter armoured Japanese tanks. The history on this one, from what we know, it was actually used by the Brazilian forces in northern Italy, which is always quite interesting because a lot of people don't really think about the Brazilians being in the war at all, let alone driving these sort of vehicles. So it's always quite interesting to know about that sort of stuff. Now, the M3a1 wasn't just the only one of its kind. There was a crazy amount of different variants, but they mostly come into 2 brackets, the M3 and the M5. In total, they made a little over 22,000 of these. Now, with this one, it was a 4-man crew, and you can see inside, it would have been absolute hell to be inside. So cramped, absolute tiny space. Obviously you had the driver, you'd have the co-driver, and then inside you'd have the gunner and the loader as well, obviously one of which would be the commander. But you can imagine being in there in the heat of North Africa, it would be absolutely dreadful. Now, like I say, we did restore this one a couple years ago, and when we got it, it was an absolute burnt out hull, wrecked. It had been sat there for years. I believe 14 of them originally got brought into the UK, and you'll see as the picture on screen now, it was an absolute state when we got it. Took us a little bit of time, but now I would say happily she is probably one of the most beautiful M3a1 Stuarts in the world, because just look at her, she is a lovely one. But let's move on to the next vehicle. Now, as I said earlier, what the definition of a tank was, here are two more armoured vehicles that we have in our collection that aren't tanks, but yeah, we'll include them anyway because they're pretty cool. This one here, which is one of the only vehicles that we don't own as part of our collection, this is the Stug, owned by a couple of friends of ours. Now, the people who are, I'm sure people are already commenting down below, it's not a real Stug, we know, it's a replica. It's based on an FV432 body, but it is a very nice replica. Gets used quite a lot for a lot of driving. Inside, it has a Cummins engine, so a modern engine, but it makes it that much better to drive. And the next one that isn't a tank, because it hasn't got a movable turret, although it does tick all the other boxes, is the one behind me, the Sexton self-propelled artillery gun. Now, this ended up being one of the longest restorations we did. It ended up taking, I think, something like 5 years. Now, you might be thinking, bloody hell, that is a long amount of time. The reason for that is because until about, well, year 3.5, in total, we spent about 8 days on it. So we'd do about 2 days a year on it, which is why the restoration took so long. Now, this one's pretty cool because it is what we believe to be the very first Sexton ever made. On its hull, it's got the number 1 wrote on it in a few, well, engraved into it in a few different places, meaning it's a very good chance this is number 1, which adds quite a cool bit to its history. Now, I'm not going to spend too much time on this vehicle because we're obviously talking about tanks and it's a self-propelled artillery gun, but it was the British one and also used a lot by the Commonwealth as well. It weighs about 28 tons and the gun on top was a 25-pounder. But let's move on to the next one. Now, this one is going to upset a lot of people. Technically tank number 12 to 22 because we have 10 of them. This is the FV43230. Now, remembering what the Oxford Dictionary says is a tank, the 43230 does tick all of those boxes. It's got tracks, it's got armour, and it has got a turret that moves around on top. Now, a lot of people always think that the 432s with the turrets on top, that they never actually used them, but they did. Now, originally, they made 13 of these, and they used them to patrol around the British sector of the Berlin Wall. So at one point, the British Army did actually use these. It's not just something that random people have added on top at post-service. So technically, if you look at it that way, they are tanks. So for those of you good at maths, that takes us up to 10 different variants of tanks. Now, when you include obviously all of the extras like the other M60 we have, the reproductions, and the fleet of FV43230s we have, that takes us up to a grand total of 22, which is pretty impressive, especially as that doesn't include all of the other vehicles that we have here as part of our collection. Now, before we finish, a few vehicles that very nearly fit the definition of a tank, but aren't a tank, starting with this one right behind me. It is our Sherman Jumbo. Now, you might be thinking, hold on, a Sherman Jumbo, that is a tank. And you'd be correct if it was restored. At the minute, it's nowhere near finished restoring, so technically it's just either what some people would call a hot tub, others would call a restoration project. We've got a load of parts, so at the minute it's just a bunch of parts. Hopefully next year we'll be getting onto it and it will be restored by the end of next year. Here's hoping. Nitro's currently looking at me from behind the camera with a very scared look on his face. But yeah, that's the plan. And once it is fully restored, then we can comfortably say it's a tank. At the minute, it's just a bunch of parts at the minute. The next tank that isn't a tank is this one behind me. It's a Bradley. Well, I say quote unquote Bradley. You might be looking at it going, that's a very strange looking Bradley. And you'd be right. It's not actually a Bradley. It's an FV432 that we've converted for a movie into a Bradley. So last year we went down to a film called Warfare and we helped well, we helped out with it. We had 2 of these vehicles that were used in the film. So if you have seen that film and you saw these driving around, they were part of the Armourgeddon collection. One of which we've now converted back to a 432, but this one we've kept mainly because we get quite a lot of people come to the museum who have seen that film and are quite interested to see it. You know, it's a bit of history. Not as famous as Fury, but it's famous to us. Moving on to the next one is this old girl behind me that you can see is looking rather worse for wear. This is the M74. Now, you might be looking at it and thinking, oh, great, that's going to be one of our other restoration projects. Unfortunately not. With this one, the idea with this, it's sort of a donor vehicle for the Sherman Jumbo. As you can imagine, getting parts for a Jumbo is very difficult. So when you find a vehicle like this, which was actually originally it was a Sherman 105, we're using it as a donor vehicle. Unfortunately, as things go, trying to find parts for these vehicles, sometimes you have to take 2 to turn them into one really nice one. Unfortunately, that's just part of the job. But it's not all lost. Hopefully, once we've got all these bits and bobs off it, we have got somebody who is interested in buying it and restoring it back to its former glory, which would be quite nice. Next, we move on to a vehicle that's part of the FV432 family. It is the FV433, commonly known as the Abbott. Now, as you can see by the tracks just running along here, it looks the exact same as a 432. It's just pretty much from here upwards is where it changes. The reason for that is it's part of the same family. So the idea is, you know, you've got 432s, you've got 434s, you've got all these different vehicles, all using very similar parts or the same parts, makes it a lot easier to maintain and look after. For this one, all the running gear is the exact same. The engine all uses the same parts, but it is a completely different configuration. It's more of a sort of flatter rectangle rather than a taller square, if that makes sense. They started making these in the mid-1960s and used them all the way up, I believe, to about 2014. In total, you would have 6 blokes inside here crewing it. The engine is still a Rolls-Royce, as with all the other 4.3s. Now, as you can see here, it's got the turret. The turret is actually a 105mm, which is the exact same size as the Sherman that we've got in our collection. Obviously a different gun, but same size, which is quite interesting. In total, I believe they made about 230, I think slightly over 230 of these as well. So let's move on to the next one. And the last vehicle, it's not a tank. It very nearly ticks all the boxes of being a tank, but this is the M8 Greyhound, as you can see, the armoured scout car. It nearly ticks all the boxes. It's got a turret on top that can spin a full 360 and shoot. It's got armour. The one thing it's missing is the tracks down below. Obviously, this has got 6 wheels instead as a armoured car. Why am I showing you it? Pretty much just to show, obviously, we've got a load of other vehicles here at the Armourgeddon Museum, not just tanks. Obviously, we've got armoured cars, we've got trucks, we've got half-tracks, got a bit of everything, really. We are always looking to add to the collection. We're always looking to restore more vehicles, buy more vehicles. So if you do know of any, by all means, let us know. But thank you very much for watching, and we'll see you guys in the next video. And also, please do keep it civil in the comments when you guys are about to talk about the 432s. Cheers.